at the end of the day, the human brain is capable of amazing things, but you're going to get outperformed for long division by a pocket calculator.
We had shared earlier that there's a speaker in our array who thinks that all this conversation about AI is misplaced and it's short-term because there's a much more powerful technology coming, and that is the human brain without the body and the limitations that you might want to need a drink of water while speaking. So how about the human brain without the limitations of the body outside it? As we said, this is some really frontier thinking. It's not science fiction, it's science, because we are seeing it happening in real time. So, ladies and gentlemen, to wrap our heads around this completely frontier jaw-drop thought and technology and science, please welcome on stage Brett Kagan. And in conversation with him will be Ritika Passi, who's the executive editor of Lucid Lines, and Aaryaman Vir Shah, who is a tech investor and the founder of Tigerfeathers. And they're both going to try and help us, as I said, wrap our heads around this completely wild thought of us now being without our bodies. What are the uses and what is the science that's driving this? So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome them on stage.
We've talked about making machines come as close to replicating the human mind. But here is a startup, an Australian startup, which is going in the exact opposite direction. They are putting human brain cells on a chip, and not a chip in a brain. What Brett calls inside-out Neuralink. Brett, why don't you explain this concept to us?
Absolutely, thank you so much. So we became really interested in the idea of the potential of what brain cells are able to achieve. And it was exciting because at the end of the day, although there has been amazing progress made in artificial intelligence, the holy grail is something called artificial generalized intelligence, a flexible and adaptable system. But the only thing we know for certain that can lead to that is biology, right? Whether you look at bugs or cats or humans, we all show a level of generalized intelligence. And so we kind of asked ourselves the question, why try mimic what we could harness? And with synthetic biology techniques, we can grow those cells and we can start to manipulate them and interact with them and see what we can actually achieve.
So the human mind as the OG of intelligence, effectively.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
All right, and we've seen the statistics before in the previous session as well. They flashed on our visuals. It's what, 80, 90 billion neurons, and which are making synaptic connections in the trillions. In fact, there is a university in Australia that is going to be releasing something called Deep South, which is expected to reach near the number of synaptic connections that a human mind does. And yet, Brett is now going to talk about the technology that he's developing.
Absolutely.
And why that might be better than Deep South.
Well, I think I will just preface that by saying it's the right tool for the right job. And the technology that many people are building out there, they do have distinct uses where they will excel. I mean, at the end of the day, the human brain is capable of amazing things, but you're going to get outperformed for long division by a pocket calculator. So we've been looking at trying to build out, and you can see here an example of the electrical activity of biological neurons, brain cells. And they'll display this just spontaneously, even if you leave them alone in a dish. And what we want to do, though, and see is that if we start putting information in, electrical information in, what are we actually able to achieve? So here's an example about some of the brain cells that we've actually put. It's that gray goop that you can see forming those connections, and behind it on the red, that's actually one of the chips we use. And Ritika had another one somewhere. And so we're actually able to embed these, and electricity then forms this shared language between the biology and the silicon. And what we can do is we can put information into that system. This is a little bit from a paper we published on it. So we can put information in Oop. Okay, pointer doesn't work. We can put information into a region that we designated as a sensory region, and we can read information out of regions we called motor regions. And if we provide the right sort of feedback, we can investigate if learning actually occurs. It's playing. So you can see here an example of the system where we're actually recording the electrical activity in each of these little squares. And we were curious that if we shaped the environment in the right way, would the neurons remodel their activity and actually get better at playing a game? And we started with Pong because that was the classic thing that people started with machine learning. And to begin with, the cells naturally weren't very good at playing the game. But we found that even just over 5 minutes of real time, you saw a significant improvement if you compare, say, the first 5 to the last 5 of a 20-minute game. And these cells were dramatically changing the way that they reorganized themselves to achieve this. And it seems like that has crashed. So the brittleness of silicon-based computing in action. But yeah, that's the idea of what we thought we'd try and achieve.
Fantastic. Well, shall we talk about the tech then? But before that, good evening everyone, and thank you so much to Lucid Lines for having us all here at this incredible event. If you're enjoying it, please put your hands together for the entire team that's put this on. Now let's talk about this incredible science. Dr. Kagan or Brett, can I ask you a few questions just to make sure that we lay people can understand what you're doing in a way that is accurate? So to begin with, you collect a blood sample, could be from a human or a rodent or anything like that. That blood sample is then you use a technology, an established technology which already exists, for which scientists have won Nobel Prize, to create these pluripotent stem cells, which can then be reprogrammed to express as individual specialized organ cells. In your case, you get them to differentiate as brain cells. And you grow these brain cells in a special container. And brain cells form these neurons as they grow. What is the special container about? What is unique about that?
So I'll unpack a few things there. The first thing you mentioned is how we get the cells. And I think it's incredibly important to emphasize this. We're well aware that when you deal with biology, sometimes it can make people feel uncomfortable, even very well-meaning, intelligent people. I had a great conversation with someone last night who started off saying, you know, you seem nice, but I just think the work you're doing is evil. And we had a great conversation about why that actually was, and at the end of the day, I think they felt comfortable enough to say, you know what, it sounds like there's more to be learned here. And we do focus on these, as you said, pluripotent cells, because they can be developed from any willing donor with a simple blood donation and turned into a renewable and ethically sustainable source of cells. And then, as you said, it's a matter of generating them into neurons. But once you have the neurons, obviously a significant challenge is how do you interact with them? And that's where we're building devices like the one you can see on screen today, and there's a demo unit here as well. Essentially, it's a device that allows us to read the small electrical pulses that neurons will emit as they are active, but also it can deliver these electrical pulses to transmit information to the neurons. And the challenge, of course, is in building that to be what we call a closed loop, where we can record the activity, we can use that activity to update a game world, or any world, and then change the environment for the information we feed back to the neurons. And yeah, this device is something that helps us do this, as well as keep the cells alive with all the nutrients that they need and the right temperature, gases, etc.
Okay, very fascinating. So you've got this closed loop environment in which the brain cells are growing, you're keeping them healthy, and the language they speak, to put it crudely, is the language of electrical impulses, and you're able to read the impulses that they make as well as provide them with feedback in this continuous closed loop. And what you've chosen to do with Cortical Labs is find a way to represent the video game Pong, which consists of a moving paddle and a ball that goes and breaks bricks. You found a way to represent that game to these neurons in the language that they understand, again, to put it crudely. And then you watch these neurons as when they lose the game or miss the ball, then they are provided with a certain kind of stimulus, and when they hit the ball or do something good, they are provided with another kind of stimulus. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're seeing is that given these stimuli, they are getting better at learning how to play the game. Is that correct, and how does this kind of work?
Look, how it works is a question we're also still trying to answer ourselves, and while we've uncovered some really fascinating things, there's still more questions to ask. The first idea we wanted to test is how do you fundamentally interact with neurons to elicit intelligence, but not at the level of reinforcement learning, which is common in machine learning. We're talking about at the level of information, at the level of entropy. And so there was a great theory built up by Professor Carl Friston, who's based at University College London, and he basically proposed an idea that what a brain is trying to do is create predictability in its environment. And so we said, if that's true, a neural system, even a simple neural system, should reorganize its activity to avoid, say, random stimulation and to increase the likelihood of being able to predict the environment. And so it's an incredibly simple implication from quite a complex theory, but it was something we could use this technology to test, and the results were surprisingly supportive. I think the only thing better as a scientist than supporting a controversial theory is to actually challenge the controversial theory, but at the end of the day, our data was overwhelmingly supportive.
Brett, if I can ask you, why human brains on a chip when the majority of the world is going in the other direction? What is it about the human brain and our neurons that makes sense for us to use them? In one of our previous sessions, Javed Akhtar made that point, no, where he said that why put AI in the driver's seat, right? We have a brain, now we have the science, why can't we expand the potential of the human brain? And this seems to be what you're doing. Why?
So I think the exciting thing is that this is a platform technology, and the initial use cases of that platform technology might seem quite rudimentary, but don't forget that for silicon computing, the initial use cases were doing stuff in a lab in a university setting. For us, some of the potential benefits of this tool are the things that biology is good at. Learning with very little data. You know, we talk about intelligence a lot, but there's so many aspects that are unique to biological, perhaps even human intelligence. Our intuition, it's hard to operationalize that, but it's incredibly powerful. Our instincts, this is built in. So as along with that, also, they run with incredibly power-efficient mechanisms. So our brains use 20 watts, 30 watts of power.
To give you an example, or to provide an example of basically what Brett is saying, a human brain can distinguish between a cat and a dog by seeing one image of each. AI, to train it to see, to recognize a cat, requires tens of thousands of images. I don't have the exact figure in mind, but when ImageNet, the first collection of images, was put together by AI scientist Fei Li, it was, I believe, 14,000 images of cats for the AI system to learn to recognize that, okay, this is a cat. There's another example. We know that Google's DeepMind AI, which beat a human player at Go in 2016. It took about 175,000, 160,000 games for it to learn how to win. If a human were to do that, if a human were to process or learn from that data set, it would take a human, if a human played 5 hours a day, it would take a human 175 years to go through that amount of data.
So there are unique capabilities with these systems, but there's also something about it being able to reflect us. So for those who are in the area and for those who aren't, I'll explain more, but for, let's say, drug discovery and disease modeling, neurological disease is a significant burden. I mean, we've heard how often it pops up in aging, but even not with aging, there's still significant impacts. So if we can build a better model of the brain in a dish, we can better test drugs. or even better understand their diseases to find other forms of therapies.
So we know that 3D organs are a thing. We are 3D printing hearts now on a chip. They're tiny yet, but this is going beyond that. We're talking about organoid intelligence, I believe. That's what the phrase is. Can you tell us how far advanced is this science, is this technology? Because ultimately, what are we talking about, right? If we can use the power of the human brain and the infinite digital potential that chips bring, then there's enormous potential out there, use cases out there. You mentioned drug discovery, for example. The computing power of the human brain, its efficiency, the fact that it doesn't need that much data to learn, a fraction of the data to learn, actually, that it needs only that.
Yes, so look, how far is the technology? I think there's been a huge amount of theoretical work that lays a beautiful foundation. There's been a huge amount of work in developing synthetic biology, what we like to call wetware, and building up these neurons. But the tooling to interact with them has been limited. But actually what we've been working on is a way to make that far more accessible. So if you like, I could even show you, like right now, some cells that we have back in Melbourne and how easy we've made it to just explore and stimulate them.
Let's do that.
So we have my laptop here, and if they're able to flick over to that screening. So these are the literal brainwaves from neurons that we have in the dish live in Melbourne right now. And right here doesn't look so active because they're quite young. But what's interesting is even though these are very young, they still have connections. So if you drop in and you stimulate, and by just clicking on this here, then you will see, there we go. It's a little delayed, I think, with the description. But you can see here the network that has risen up. And then if you go to older cells, here's some of the older cells that we have that are a bit more active. If you like, you can even just click around, just click on any blocks and drop stimulation in, and you can start to explore and see how these cells will respond. Obviously, we can also deliver far more complex stimulation if we want, but even the ability to interact with brain cells over the cloud with this simplicity is a significant advancement in the field. And then,
you
of course,
might even say that this talk is stimulating minds all the way from India to Australia.
Exactly. And of course, we're also working to try and take away the difficulty of keeping these things alive. So that's this box that you saw on the screen before and is sitting here. It actually perfuses them with all the nutrients that they need to be able to keep the cells alive and healthy.
So can I double-click on the work you're doing again to make sure that we understand what Cortical Labs is aiming to do when you say platform for wetware? So as we discussed in the Pong example, you found a way to sort of represent this Pong game state to these neurons, which are growing on the chip, and they are learning, based on the stimuli that you provide, what they should be doing and how to reorganize themselves to be better at that specific task of Pong. And they seem to be learning and improving. But what you as a company want to do is you want to give this technology and the means to stimulate and manipulate these neurons to other researchers so that they can figure out novel applications, different programs, which may not be video games, which may be other things, for figuring out if we can leverage the innate capabilities of the human brain to A, accomplish tasks or process information, or B, also test them to see if medicines can be derived from them.
Yeah, and those are just the first applications. And so the really neat thing about this is that as you refine each application, it naturally will lead on to other applications. So at the beginning, let's say it's basic science research. How does brain cells work to process information? I mean, that in itself is asking the fundamental question really about what makes us as humans, I think most people agree that the thing that makes a human really unique is their brain. So just being able to investigate these questions is pretty impactful. But then you can go on. Once you understand that, there's nothing to stop you, as we say, testing drugs, building information processing systems, potential targets and stuff like even, say, cybersecurity management. A system that's able to identify something that's different with very few samples could have use cases there. Or even entertainment. We all had Tamagotchis, right, as a kid. imagine a little system that has its own little biological intelligence and a diversity that could have in a toy.
Before we talk a little bit more about use cases, when you click on these cells, basically on these neurons, you give an electrical impulse and they
Yes.
react. That means that there is some cognitive function that we are seeing. That then means that they are intelligent, that they're sentient.
Well, the word choice is such an interesting thing, so I wouldn't use the word cognitive. And I think this is actually one of the big problems that the field faces, is we don't have the language to properly talk about this. But I'm actually thrilled that there are so many people who are eager to tackle this problem. So we're working with a number of different labs and independent ethicists and philosophers around the world, and hoping to be able to bring forward and turn some agreement so we can actually agree on the language, and then figure out what actually defines these different terms. And the only way that I believe we're going to get to the bottom of this is by building up systems like this, testing them, and just learning more. It's only through knowledge that we're going to be able to figure out the right way to go forward.
From what I understand, if any neural network shows neural activity, if a network shows neural activity, it cannot be declared legally dead. So if it's not legally dead, then it must be alive. And then that raises the ethical question of using these cells outside the human body. What is your personal position? I understand what Cortical Labs is doing. You're working with a team of international experts, ethicists and biologists and neuroscientists. What do you personally think?
I think it asks the question, what is life? So, if you go back, there was animal life, plant life, and human life. This is Aristotelian sort of basics, ancient Greek philosophy. And I think even if you go to, say, animal ethics, there's this famous quote where it says the question is not can they talk nor can they reason, but can they suffer? And they're talking about animals. And, well, it might even be possible that we've developed a new type of life. Maybe it can talk, maybe it can reason, but we could build them so they can't suffer. And so our goal really is to take an engineering approach to this, to understand what we're doing, to do it cautiously and responsibly, but maybe what we're doing is inventing a new type of life that can actually do things that previously weren't achievable.
So we're not talking about post-humans, which was what the previous session was about, but a new form of life nonetheless.
Yeah,
Potentially.
Potentially. And certainly what we're looking at is extending beyond silicon computing. And I think it's inevitable that something people like to call heterogeneous compute is coming. We already have it, arguably. You have your CPU, you have your GPU, if you can find someone who's not running LLMs on them. And maybe one day you'll have your BPU, your biological processor, and your quantum processor. And it's using, as I said before, the right tool for the right job once we've identified what that is.
That's quite a striking image, isn't it? Like today we're used to seeing servers and data centers sort of carrying out tasks that are useful for us. But one day we might be thinking of labs filled with brains carrying out tasks for us. What are some of the most kind of mind-bending use cases or ideas that you've come across while working on this exciting topic?
So I think the most exciting use cases, so if you're going to go out in the future, and we can't say exactly when this would be, because it depends on how we progress this technology, and my personal hope is that we can progress it as a community, because when we can work together and iterate as a community, we can always accelerate progress. But something like robotics, at the end of the day, you mentioned how many samples machine learning needs to be able to adapt to a task. And of course, an added problem is once it learns that task, if you change any parameter in the task, there's a thing called catastrophic forgetfulness, where the machine learning task will just fail. But biology doesn't do that. So robotics seems like a key idea. If you want your robot to go into a novel environment and adapt, that's certainly one use case. But there are other, perhaps even more futuristic ideas that this could enable one day. At the end of the day, if we're dealing with the fundamentals of intelligence and how we process information, is it possible that we could actually lead to systems where we can transmit information directly in and out of the brain, like people are so interested in BCIs? Could this form an interface between the BCI and a computer? We heard earlier today some of the challenges with what BCIs can achieve, and while they have huge potential, there are limitations. Perhaps this could overcome the limitations. Ultimately, the more we understand the fundamentals of what leads to intelligence at that level of information, the more we can manipulate, leverage, and enhance it. So I think there's a number of outcomes that this work could lead to one day, and the question really is, how do we get there? How do we get there safely? And who's coming along for the ride? You know, in other words, how do we get the community to be interacting with it as well?
Brett, here, if I can intervene, there's one use case we haven't mentioned. We've mentioned drug discovery, and I believe you actually used an earlier prototype of this to test whether drugs for epilepsy were acting effectively on certain cells. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we've heard the healthcare use case. There's another use case, however, that you haven't mentioned quite yet, which is in the national security/defense arena. And before our imaginations run wild towards killer robots that are powered by human brains effectively, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that Cortical Labs has received funding from the venture capital arm of CIA, as well as from Australia's intelligence office. What could the potential use cases there be?
Well, I think it touches on sort of what I was talking about. At the end of the day, being able to understand intelligence at its fundamental level opens up so many doors for how we can process. And I think what's great is a lot of these, although they often their PR, let's say, is focused on very certain things, simply advancing science in new and innovative directions is something that these groups are interested in. But stuff.
So, for example, cybersecurity. Now
Cybersecurity was the example I was going to bring up.
Yeah. So, how could this power cybersecurity much more effectively?
So, with cybersecurity, look, we have a lot of protocols in place now. It's not like the old days where you click on one bad link in your computer and it needs to be taken out to the trash. But what we don't really have good controls for is stuff like zero-day exploits, where someone gets into your system using something that was previously unknown, and you need to wait and you need to have, at the current moment, some sort of machine learning or other program system try and identify, is something off? And it needs to take a lot of data to do that. So what if you could build a device that all it does is monitor activity and looks for aberrant patterns? Biology is good at spotting aberrant patterns. We can all look at, pictures or images, and if we see something out of the ordinary, we're able to immediately identify it.
You could even call it maybe biological intuition as a service.
We might need to borrow that from you as a term.
Before we end this panel, there's one aspect that we haven't quite talked about yet. So, when I'd asked you why human brain cells on a chip, there's one thing that we haven't yet talked about, which is the sustainability aspect. So the human brain uses anywhere between 12 watts to 20 watts of power a day. This is less than a light bulb, and exponentially less than what a supercomputer or what a laptop uses.
We're talking hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions, depending on how you want to crunch the numbers, less.
So effectively, we're talking about efficient machines, greener machines, and then it just depends on who's doing the using, whether it's used for welfare or whether it's used for warfare. Is that safe to say?
Of course, at the end of the day, any tool can always be misused, but people are going to build tools to misuse whatever the case. And currently, we do not have the capability. If we want to talk about equity and distribution of resources and tools, we do not have the ability to generate enough power for everyone to have their own bespoke LLM, ChatGPT running. The amount of power is large.
It takes, I think I read somewhere that anywhere, either a single prompt or anywhere between 5 to 50 prompts that you put in ChatGPT requires 500 milliliters of water. So
it's not sustainable. And maybe building up systems like this, look, maybe then, let's say that, like, at the worst case, they're not going to be as great to achieve certain tasks. But if they can be done sustainably, this is something that's worthwhile to investigate. We need to be able to be flexible. And at the end of the day, we live in a biological world. We're made of biology. The things that we need to survive are made of biology. maybe using biology as a way that we can actually have access to the tools that we need in a way that doesn't scorch the earth.
Aaryaman, any last questions?
I had one which ties back to the previous talk with Dr. Vaidya, talking about the human condition and consciousness. So I realized that as you work on this field, you're actually advancing the frontier. We're learning more about the mind, the brain, and how that works. And what I found very interesting is that the way that you train these brains is by, as you said, giving them predictability. So like the positive feedback is in the form, one of the levers you have that seems to work is you give the neurons a repeatable sort of signal. And the negative feedback is a very disorderly, chaotic signal. And it seems as though biological systems tend to optimize for stability. And I just thought that, of course, we're learning as we go, and there may be other levers that work, but I thought that that's interesting because it helps us learn about ourselves and about our fellow organisms.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, there are, of course, other levers. This was one really interesting idea that we wanted to test, and the results were strongly supportive, but I don't think they were supportive that this was the only lever. And I think as we build this picture up, we've done other follow-up studies, and we've looked at things like just the patterns of activity that arise in these systems. And there's a really special trait, I won't get too detailed, but there's a special trait that arises in human and animal brains, but also just in flocks of birds and fish and water in a cup being mixed, called criticality, which is this balance between order and chaos, right? And it makes sense, I think, intuitively that our brains, they can't be too ordered, they can't be too chaotic, they have to sit in the middle. And in humans, that's been linked to all sorts of cognitive processes. And there's been a lot of controversy around exactly what it does. And so using these systems, for example, we're able to find that even our systems will balance themselves on this between order and chaos when they're given this structured information for the game, but not when they're just left alone. So they're fundamentally changing their shape. So I think it provides us an ability to reflect at exactly what leads to intelligence and what will ultimately shape us, both in the terms of this technology and as humans.
This kind of brings us back around to intelligence and consciousness, but we're not going to go down that, time's up, but also we're not going to go down that rabbit hole because that's saved for tomorrow, so please look forward to it. I want to end with a statement that the founder of NVIDIA, which created the chips that have effectively enabled the semiconductor industry, nanocircuitry, and the technology that powers these neural networks that today we know as AI. He said that, the founder of NVIDIA said that we've made transistors and chips as small as they can get. We can't go any smaller. So for transistors and chips, the smaller it is, the better it is, because that increases the computational power. So maybe brain on a chip is the way to go to basically not hit a wall. I think he said, 4 years? That's the upper limit at the moment. After 4 years, there's not going to be any mega enhancement in computational power of these AI systems because the chips cannot go any smaller. So maybe this is the solution. Thank you, Brett, for sharing this wonderful and frontier cutting-edge technology with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.